So good morning, everybody. As we know, on Monday, we moved into step 3 of the government roadmap. Now, we've been covering the steps incrementally as we've gone along. So we have mentioned step 3. Many of you will have attended Joe's excellent training sessions with really good guidance around risk assessments. So I don't plan to go over that. This is really just an opportunity to highlight the key areas and any areas that may be causing confusion from the guidance. So I'm just going to share my screen. Ray, if you can just let me know when that's visible. Lovely. So the updated guidance is now here on the front screen. The legislation hasn't changed. It's remained the same, constant. So if you did want to check out the guidance, the legislation, the link is here. The guidance does summarize it very well, but if you should find any contradictory information in the guidance from the government, it's always best to go to the legislation to check. So just a recap really of the 4 tests. So these are the tests that the government said they would introduce in between each step as we've gone on. So the feeling was before the 17th of May that these tests were still okay. And so we were able to open up as planned on the 17th of May, this Monday. The final one of the 4 tests, so the new variants, is obviously something that is fluctuating. We are seeing increased incidence, positive test results across the country, particularly in isolated areas where there is large population that may have returned from or have contact with people who've returned from India, and also in densely populated areas. So we are seeing some increases. Those increases are predominantly amongst young people, so people that haven't been vaccinated as yet, and also as a result of the age of the people that are contracting coronavirus, we're not seeing any surge in hospital admissions. So I think the government are going to spend the next 4 weeks very diligently keeping their eye on the data around new variants, as well as whether any of this is moving into a surge in hospital admissions. If we do start to see that, then I think it would probably be fairly safe to assume that we won't be opening on the 21st of June in the way that was anticipated. If we start to see the new variants coming under control, if we don't see what we might see is that the 21st will remain as an opening date. We won't know that until the data is collected over the 4-week period. So if you have got plans around much larger events that won't involve social distancing, you really will need to keep an eye on guidance coming out over the next 4 weeks and what is looking like it's happening around the new variant, particularly obviously the Indian variant at the moment. So I've left on here step 1, step 2, guidance for the simple reason that I think it's useful for you to have it. If we were at any stage to go back a step, then you've actually got a quick, easy guide to go back to, which has got those previous steps. But the new guidance that comes in does supersede that guidance. So it's only there really as a reference point so that you've got all the slides together. It doesn't mean that actually anything that's in that guidance negatively reflects on the changes that have happened now for step 3. So one area that I wanted to highlight was in the guidance for multi-purpose buildings, which many of you may have downloaded. And if you don't, the link is coming up shortly and it may be something that you'd want to download. This guidance was updated on the 17th of May, but maybe not quite as carefully as we would have liked. And there is a discrepancy. In section 2, which is around safety measures, section 2A talks about support groups and still refers to them as 15 as capacity, which of course isn't correct now that we've moved into step 3. When you go on to section 3, which talks about activity, section 3A clearly states within it that the capacity for support groups is 30, and all of the government guidance does as well. So it's section 3A that you would want to be following. It does cause confusion when there is difference in the guidance, which is why I say if you're ever in doubt, do go to the legislation. But the support group guidance is very clear. It's just obviously an error in the updating that section 2A didn't get updated. And I imagine that's because the guidance around cleaning, cleanliness and hygiene are exactly the same now as they were in our earlier stages. So I think that's probably why it wasn't seen and wasn't updated. If a new update comes in, normally what's happened is the link remains the same, even though it's been updated. So if the link does change, we'll obviously notify people, but that link should still be the same link for the multi-purpose buildings. So the other big one that's caused a little bit of confusion is around controlled indoor events and the 50% capacity. So for indoor events, when they talk about that 50% capacity, that's up to a maximum of 1,000. So if you could fit more than 1,000 people into your venue, you'd still have to work as though it was 1,000. So the maximum you could have in that building would be 500. Almost regardless of its size. For anyone who's working with numbers under 1,000, you're going to be looking at about guidance that should fit into social distancing and safe practice. So if after assessing your hall and things like the entrance and the exits, you think there's no way you can run at 50% capacity, you'll need to bring that down. So that's a kind of a maximum figure really to work from, and then bring that 50% capacity down depending on things like your entrance and exits. Now, if you have the luxury in your building of being able to have one for entrance and one for exit, that's going to make a massive difference. If you've got people entering and exit through the same doorway, then you're going to have to bear that in mind. Is there room to keep a flow of people moving, or will it become a congregation point? And if it does, it has to be a congregation point that really people aren't stood in for 15 minutes or longer. So those are the kind of things that can have a really big impact on capacity. We're now able to offer food and drinks, which is really lovely to have those things back. We want to really keep people remaining seated as much as possible, but they can come up to a counter to get their food or to place their order, but you do want to encourage people to be seated as much as possible. Concerts and plays can go on, but please do remember social distancing and capacity rules, the same for indoor sports activities. We've now got a lift on people being able to attend weddings, receptions and funerals of up to 30 people, and christenings and bar mitzvahs and other life event celebrations can take place. So for outdoor activities, what we've seen is that the rule of 6 has been replaced by a 30 people limit. So that's a group of 30. Indoor activities, then we're at the rule of 6, 2 households and no mingling. So if you've got a variety of groups going on, you've got a variety of activities, you've got a show, you need to reduce mingling, and you need to have good signs up, reminding people to stay within the group they arrived in. In fact, signage is going to be very important. There's a real emphasis on making sure that we act as good community advocates, that we're reminding people of the things that they should be doing in their community, such as the washing hands, covering face, keeping space, and of course, using as much ventilation in any buildings as possible. But we should be advocates, so good signage in the toilets to remind people about hand washing. I know from the fact that a nasty stomach bug has gone through my son's school and has hit the community, tells me that little boys are not perhaps hand washing in the way that we would like them to. Now there's a shocker, but what we have to do, of course, is try and keep those things going. So I actually went through my son's school bag, realised that he doesn't have hand sanitizer in there anymore, and I've put the hand sanitizer in with a nice marker pen on the hand sanitizer to tell him that I'll be monitoring its usage. I hope that just doesn't mean he's squeezing it down the sink, but anyway, who knows? We can only do what we can do. And that's basically what we should be doing in our communities, doing what we can do, making sure that hand sanitizer is available, making sure we model good practice, and making sure that our signage is reinforcing those messages as much as possible to the community. If you wanted to have a quick look at what we can do now that we've hit step 3, this is probably the easiest link. Just takes you to a summary of what's changed and what you can do now that we're in May. So when we look at reopening, it's still about being cautious. Make sure you plan and make sure all of the stages that you're going through have a delay built into them. So for example, if June the 21st doesn't happen, if we end up having to move back a little bit, maybe our support group sizes, something like that, that we've actually inbuilt that into our planning to make sure that we can be flexible and robust. So try and make sure that that's how your risk assessments look for your organizations, because you should have an organizational risk assessment that talks about things like if staff get sick, or if your trustee board gets reduced in numbers, or if you don't have the volunteers you need. So both that type of risk assessment and the one that involves things like health and safety, do make sure that you've thought about what happens if there is a delay, what happens if there is a small clawback in some of the extra restrictions that have been lifted for this step. Do check that you're safe to reopen, that you've done all of the health and safety checks that you would need to do after your building's been closed for a while. It's really important you make sure that everything is up to date as possible. Test, trace and isolate procedures are still in place. So that means that you will need a QR code, one of the NHS ones, and the link will be coming up shortly. You need to have that in your building. And you also need to supply a non-digital option for sign-in. So you will also need paper copies. If people are using the QR, they do not need to sign in as well. But if they can't use that, if they haven't got the digital option on their phone, then you need to make sure that they're able to sign in pen and paper. And that's the same message that you need to get through to anybody holding an activity in your venue. It's really important that they know they've still got to carry on keeping that information. And that's for 21 days. And that's so in case we have an outbreak in a building or at an activity, we're able to isolate other people that may have come into contact as soon as possible. And that's the way that will prevent community spread. So it is really important as these restrictions get lifted that we're using as the best practice possible to make sure we minimize community spread. Remember that we've got lots of resources available from previous lockdowns, from having been here before when we looked at reopening, and a lot of that guidance is still incredibly valid. So we've got all the most up to date on our website. Do make use of it. And the Health and Safety Executive is also a really good source of advice. So for many of you that do manage community buildings, or you're planning on going into one, or you're going to run an activity in one, there can be a lot of concern about the fact that we're moving inside. And this is particularly true for more vulnerable members of our community, where there may be some reluctance. And that's the last thing we want, is for people to remain isolated. We want people to re-engage back into their community as much as possible. And so what do we do? Well, in order to minimize transmission, we need to think about things like reducing close proximity. The closer we are to each other, the easier it is for viruses to spread. So we need to try and keep distance between ourselves. And that's why social distancing is so important. It's still 2 meters. That hasn't changed. It's 1 meter with mitigation. So that could be plastics. But really, we're only told to use mitigation where the 2 meter rule isn't possible. So we need to try and keep to that as much as possible and encourage it with our groups and people moving around in our facilities or taking part in our activities. We need to minimize frequency of contact. So as much as possible, keeping people into groups. So that can also be your staff or your volunteer team, trying to keep them so they're working with the same people, so that they're in shift patterns or that they're in designated areas, such as the kitchen staff aren't also the same people that bring out food to the table. That way you manage to reduce the amount of contact that's going on. And of course, the aim is to keep community prevalence as low as possible. I know that the weather for May is pretty, if there's one thing I think back to last year, it is about how fantastic the weather was during April and May, but we do need to ventilate as much as possible. And the advice that a lot of people are sending out to people taking part in activities or coming to community buildings is to wrap up warm. So do get that message out there to your patrons to say that you may want to have an extra thick jumper on, or you may want to bring in a scarf or possibly even gloves, because the rooms aren't going to be as warm a temperature as we would normally have. Who knows, maybe summer will finally get here and this won't be necessary, but I think at the moment it's probably better to warn people to wrap up warm. I know my 84-year-old mother went and had her hair done, which was a very exciting expedition, and she came back, she was like a block of ice from where they had the door open and the windows and of course all the equipment blowing and the wet hair and everything else. And she said she wished she'd realised and she would have made sure that she dressed warmer and worn gloves. So I think it's a good message to get out to people. Make sure we're using those preventative measures and make sure we're promoting to the community about them as well. Do make sure that people are aware they still need to be wearing masks and they need to still be physically distancing, because people will be thinking restrictions are lifted and they don't have to do those things anymore. And it's really important that we encourage people who are ill to stay at home. So I talked about guidance. As you can see, there's quite a bit. I've numbered them because it does just look like a mass of blue on the page and can look a little bit overwhelming. The first one is probably the one that most of you will need, which is around the guidance for safe use of multi-purpose community facilities. Now that's useful if you are a community building or if you're an activity that takes part in a community building. It's very important to look at that guidance. And as I say, do be aware that section 2A section 2 hasn't been updated, but as it's mainly to do with cleanliness and hygiene, that's why. And 2A, where it refers to support groups, is inaccurate. But section 3 has been updated, and that's the one that's got the most up-to-date guidance around activities that can take place in your hall, and also if you are an activity. So there's lots of new guidance supporting youth groups and after school activities as well in there. The working safely for volunteering has also been updated, so the new link is here. The working safely during coronavirus, that I don't think has been updated, but it has all the best guidance in when it comes to keeping your premises clean and safe. And then we've got some specific guidance that has been updated, and these are around offering food, offices, and heritage locations. So these have all been updated. There are others as well, but you'll find them all on that first working safely page. The Health and Safety Executive have got some really good guidance around risk assessments and some useful templates on there. And this was the one I mentioned just earlier. If you are a youth group doing an after school activity of any description, then the guidance that you need is here. And that's the most up to date of the guidance. ACRE, of course, have also been updating their guidance, and the links are here, and you can find reference to them on our website as well. This is the most up-to-date guidance. So this is guidance that has been put together with step 3 in mind. And a really nice example of a workplace assessment, which has been reviewed, is here. So it's a good practice guidance model there, which was shared in Joe's training, and I thought it was worth actually adding to today's session. So again, a little bit of a reminder of what we mentioned before. It's really important that we model good practice. And so that means also encouraging people who are not well or maybe exhibiting symptoms or have reason to think that they might have COVID to stay away, to go away, to not be at our activities, to not be at our venue. So it's really important that we've got notices up reminding people, have you been in contact with anybody? Did you get a COVID test result, and have you self-isolated for the length of time that you need to? This is the link for the NHS QR code, which needs to be displayed by your entrance. And I should say entrances, if you have more than one in your building, it's worth having a copy on each. You sign up, it's really, really straightforward, and then your building is registered. And it means that if anybody who comes into contact with your building who does the QR code, then contracts COVID-19, other people can be notified. But remember, you also need to maintain those paper records for people that can't use the digital. And of course, you will need paper records for staff and volunteers as well. So step 4 is under review. Obviously, the hope is that everything will go back to normal from June the 21st. But at the moment, I think probably it's fair to say all bets are off. I would work towards the best, which is that everything will be lifted by then and all events can take place as they normally would. But I would keep an eye on those numbers, as we mentioned before, because those 4 tests will be key onto whether we move into step 4 on the 21st of June. And I would say probably over the next 2 weeks, we'll start to get some feeling from the government about whether we will be moving into that. Hand space and space is going to be with us for a long, long time, though, way after June the 21st. So it is really important to get into the habit of wearing face masks in public buildings, and also keeping up with that hand washing routine and not going back to our old dirty ways of not cleaning our hands properly. Use good hand sanitizers. Keep the small little one in your bag or in your car, and make sure that we keep space between each other. Even as we start to move into a state where we're being told we can hug family and friends, remember that every hug that you have is not just with the person you're hugging, it's with all the people they might also be hugging. So if we limit the people that we're having that really close interaction with as much as possible, we keep them as bubbled as much as possible so that we're keeping it within that close family, then actually what we do is we reduce the chances of community transmission. And that's really important. As we want to bring people with more clinically vulnerable people back into our community, even though they will have been vaccinated, we still need to make sure that we keep them as safe as possible. And if we keep them as safe as possible and make them feel as safe as possible, they are more likely to re-engage back into the community. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg there, really. If we build it and we So just a couple of other points that I just want to quickly really whiz through before we move on to our guest speaker today, Jen Richardson from Ward Goodman. A little bit on testing and vaccination, just a reminder that you can get your own testing. You don't have to wait until you're showing symptoms. It's easy to register for your employees and volunteers, so anybody who's front facing. And if you want to test yourself, then you can either go to your nearest lateral flow site, or you may well be able to get them through your pharmacy. And all of the links are there in order to do it. If you are doing front-facing work, particularly with any of the vulnerable categories, it's highly recommended that you are testing, even if you're keeping the social distancing rules and not having actual hands-on contact with anybody. I would see it as good practice, and I would recommend it for volunteers and for any members of staff who are in that position. Just a reminder about the importance of vaccination. They are looking at bringing forward the over 50s so that they hit 8 weeks rather than 12 weeks between the first and second vaccination. If you're if you're within a few weeks of your second vaccination, then I'm just saying my internet's unstable. Bear with me. Hopefully that helps. If you're just within a few weeks of your second vaccination, then it's probably likely that the date won't change. But if you've only recently had your first vaccination and you're over 50, there is a chance that you may find that you're being recalled in for the second vaccination just a little bit earlier, so at about 8-week mark. We haven't had confirmation on dates of that. It's just something that seems to be in the planning, so it's worth being aware of. They're obviously trying to roll out the vaccinations as soon as possible. They're targeting some key employees, teachers, teaching assistants, for example. So you may find when you go to a vaccination centre that you're having to queue, and you may have prepared of any mobility issue, or if members of your family or your community that you support do, then do make sure that when you turn up for your vaccine, you make sure that one of the volunteers, marshals, are aware that you have those issues, because then they can either prioritise you or they can move you into an area where you can be seated while you wait. So just be aware and remember why it is. You might be in a queue that's having to wait for an hour or two, but the reason for that is because we're really trying to get the number of people vaccinated up as much as possible to protect us, particularly from things like new variants that come in. If you are eligible for a vaccine, then we would encourage you to take up the offer of vaccine. If you are concerned about it, then please do make use of the good resources that are available, whether that's talking to the NHS, local community leaders, people that you trust. So, for example, your local church, or your local youth organisation, or a support group. I would recommend to people to reach out if they're at all concerned. A lot of the information that goes out through the internet and social media is often not accurate, and a lot of it can be very out of date or misleading, and sometimes it's just speculative, so it's not inaccurate, but actually it hasn't been proven one way or the other at this moment in time. So if in doubt, use good sources of information such as the NHS or public health. If you're unsure how to get hold of that information, then do speak to organisations like ourselves, and we can put you in touch with the latest guidance that is available. And just finally, a little bit on the support available. So these courses are still available on suicide prevention training and also mental health training, and they are free, and they're definitely worth checking out. And they're the kind of thing that you can just share really openly with all of your volunteers, so that anybody who needs it can have access to this training. That's the nice thing about free training when it's offered, is that you can just circulate it widely. Remember that the jobs retention scheme is still available. So if you're working at a reduced capacity, which means you can't have the same income coming in, and so therefore you need to furlough staff, do continue to do so, because that will be available until September, on the basis that some organisations are either going to be closed, nightclubs for example, and also that most organisations are going to be working at below capacity. So we've also got the Restart grant, which is available. Now, if you were given grants in the previous round, so the restriction grants that were available, the leisure hospitality grants, then you should automatically have received the Restart grant. If you haven't, then I would recommend you apply. The information that we're getting is that there was such a mix of people that received the actual retail, hospitality and leisure grant, and those who got the discretionary grant, that often people weren't sure which type of grant they got. And actually, I don't think it's been completely clear which grant they were given, even when they've gone back through paperwork. So if you received a grant previously and you haven't received the Restart grant, then we would recommend that you apply. Have a look at eligible businesses. They are listed on that first page, but do have a look at them. And then you go here for the link to take you through to the application process. It's exactly the same as before. Now, for most businesses, you are going to be operating, but you're going to have had really heavy financial impacts because of the lockdowns we've previously gone through. And that would be the thing that you'd want to emphasize in your application, is the financial impact. What does that look like? You're going to be 50% worse off, 60, you're going to be 100% worse off, 10%. Be honest about the level of impact that it's going to have on your business and your income, because that's one of the main factors that they're going to be looking at. And remember that there are organisations out there to help you, including our own. And again, these are the kind of thing that we can publicise in our community and make sure that they're aware of support that is available to them. So literally printing off this slide and sticking it up on your wall can be a really, really good way to help your community. And as I say, hands, face and space and fresh air are going to be with us for a long time. We want Dorset to remain a low incident county, and it has done a tremendous job through COVID. Phenomenal response from our volunteers, over 2,000 brand new volunteers that have come forward. And those numbers have remained remarkably stable, even with people returning back to employment. What we found is new people have come forward after that. So the vaccination programme with the marshals that are running, it's been phenomenal. And we should be incredibly proud of what we've done and how we've responded in Dorset. But let's not give up too quickly. Let's carry on. Let's see this through. Let's get to the other side of it when we can confidently believe that actually we've got to a place of safety for our county and for our country. And the way in which we'll do that is by continuing with the amazing practice that we've been doing up till now. Good hand washing technique, using hand sanitizer when we can't, keeping our face masks on to protect others whenever we're around in community buildings or congested places where there is a build-up of people and we can't restrict the space or proximity between us. Keep as much space as we can. Remember not to hit people with trolleys. Keep nice space between us when we're out and about in the supermarkets, and ventilate our buildings as much as possible. Lovely. I'm going to stop sharing at that point. So we're really, really lucky this morning to be joined by Jen Richardson from Ward Goodman. And my apologies, Jen, for not mentioning you right at the very beginning, which is when I should have said hello to you. Jen is going to do a little run through rather of some of the main financial issues that have come up and questions that have been asked by people. So both of her organisation, but also questions that have come through us too. We're also going to look at good financial management and why that is so important at a time like we're going through at the moment. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jen. It's actually good afternoon now, Jen. So good afternoon, Jen, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Just an apology in advance. One of my other hats is Treasurer of Labrador Rescue, and as a consequence, I have Labradors in my house, and I'm afraid I have a slightly pitiful whimpering going on to my right-hand side. So I just wanted to apologise in advance if it escalates in volume. So sorry about that. Just going to share my screen. Hopefully that's all visible to everybody. Thank you, Ray. So I'm just going to quickly talk through a few of the financial things and governance that you need to be aware of at the moment. Some of it is picking up on what Paul has said just now. Some of it is actually picking up on things that I've probably talked to many of you about previously, but it's all really valid and important information, and hopefully just a little reflection and reiteration of some of those key points will be useful to everybody. So I'm going to talk through some of the government support, additional expenses that you may be incurring at the moment, reserves again, and I'm so sorry. This slide actually went on the original webinar that I did for DCA back in April last year, but it is absolutely still valid for everybody, and hopefully it may prompt some thoughts or questions. I'm going to have just a touch on some of the funding considerations, practicalities, and then a little resources page. So first thing which Paul has already mentioned is Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. Absolutely use this if you need it. It's flexible, it's there to help you, it's there to support your charity, and quite frankly, having seen the vast sums of money being claimed by commercial businesses who have absolutely the funds not to have to make these claims, I am saying to every single charity that I'm working with, if you need it and you need it to do good in your community, do not feel any element of guilt about claiming it, because you're not going to be putting in claims for millions and hundreds of thousands of pounds like some of the commercial organisations have. And quite frankly, I think it's a scandal. Anyway, that's my personal view on it rather than necessarily Ward Goodman's view or anything else. But it's there, use it, and use it to help you to be able to be sustainable and to continue delivering the fantastic work that you all do. Just a point on gift aid, new legislation out last week with regard to cancelled events. So if there is uncertainty over holding an event and it's cancelled because of COVID restrictions, so say for example you were doing an outdoor event and it has to get cancelled because you can't move it indoors because of the number of attendees that you're expecting, then you can potentially claim gift aid on any event fees for anything that's cancelled, providing you hold a valid gift aid declaration for that donor. So a little bit more administration, but there is clarity, and this is after a lot of lobbying by the charity tax group, but you can certainly look at whether you can get additional gift aid on money that's in respect of cancelled events. Just to talk about VAT deferral, so lots of organisations deferred their VAT. There is still potential, if you don't have sufficient cash funds to pay those VAT deferrals over a period of time. So it's called a time to pay agreement, and it's just a case of talking to the revenue, talking to HMRC, and coming up with a sensible plan so that you can manage your cash flow. We'll talk a little bit about budgets in a minute. We also have the Restart Grants and the Recovery Loan Scheme, which Paul has just talked about. So absolutely advocate having a look and seeing if you are eligible for that. Speak to the people involved if you're not sure, or speak to your accountant, or have a conversation with us. But absolutely, there is funding, money, grants available, and if you're eligible for it, then you should absolutely take advantage of it. So having a little look at the additional expenditure that you may be incurring with opening up at the moment, so the 17th of May opening, think about what you're planning to do, what resources you need to do it, how much those resources will cost, and where the money will come from. And it's all of the things that Paula mentioned. So do you need to put screens up? Do you need to buy hand sanitizer dispensing units? Do you need to pay for new signage? Do you need to have actual physical barriers in order to separate people within your community buildings? Do you need to put something in place for having a one-way system? And does that involve, somebody nipping down to B&Q and getting a few boards, and other providers are available, obviously, but just have a think about all of those practical things that you need to do in terms of making things safe and those extra costs. Other things to think about are if you're doing room hires, are you building something else into the cost of letting out those rooms? For cleaning to happen in between different groups. So to go back to what Paula said earlier, you need to make sure there's no crossover within those activities that are happening, that you haven't got any mingling. So is there an extra cost for cleaning? Is that a cost that you're building in to your room hire fee, or is that something that you as a charity are happy to do because you're basically just delighted that people are coming back and using your buildings for the purpose for which they were intended? Need to also think about whether you have got enough volunteers in order to be able to manage your activities, or do you need to pay more staff? And that is obviously an additional cost to you as an organisation. So that's making sure that you've costed the activities, and rather than just saying, oh no, this is what our unit cost was of this particular activity, actually then building in all of those additional costs. There's a group called the Charities Buying Group, which I think DCA have put a link up before, either in the chat box or on the website. Ray, I can see you nodding in the background. They're actually very good for practical things like buying masks and screens and hand sanitizer and that sort of thing. So it's well worth just having a little bit of a shop around and seeing if there's something which is beneficial for you specifically as a charity. So what I always say when we're looking at costs is focusing on your core objectives, doing the things that you're doing really, really well. Don't try and do things differently just because there's a different financial implication. Have a look at actually costing what you want to do, what you're good at delivering, and look at, as I say, all of those potentially hidden costs in terms of carrying out those activities in a COVID safe way. So my my recycled screen on reserves and working capital. So as I say, many apologies to probably most of you who have seen it before, but it is absolutely critical that trustees and senior volunteers and senior staff within an organisation have an understanding of what you've got in your reserves and what you need in respect of working capital. So you have different types of reserves: your general, designated, restricted and permanently endowed. You need to have an understanding, to go back to my previous slide, what you need to deliver your core objectives. Having a good understanding of whether you've got scope creep due to COVID-19 activities, having a look at whether you've got assets but not actually got cash in order to be able to pay out for those additional costs. If you have restricted projects that have effectively been on hold for the last 14 months or so, have those conversations with your donors, see whether you can repurpose those funds in order to be able to deliver charitable activities that are not necessarily in accordance with what the original funding was for, because somebody might have agreed to give you funding in April 2019, and as we all know, the world has changed immeasurably since April 2019, and you might still be sat on a nice little pot of £5,000 or something that you got from a funder to do a project that actually you still can't do. So have a conversation with that funder, see whether they will let you repurpose those funds for something where you can do good within your community. And the last point on that slide is your free reserves. This is an absolutely critical figure and is the main focus for every single webinar that I have been to, that the Charity Commission have organised over the past year. So your free reserves are your unrestricted or general funds, less any fixed assets that are held within those funds. And that basically gives you the pot of money that you can spend on whatever you as a charity need to spend that money on. So it's a key figure. It's a figure which should be disclosed within the reserves policy section of your trustees report when you're submitting your financial statements. But it isn't just a year-end compliance. It's something that I think should be discussed and reviewed at trustee meetings and properly understood by all trustees, not just left to the treasurer or the accountant. So make sure that you've got an understanding of that. So just a few points on funding. Very much recommend anybody that didn't attend the funding fair on the 10th of March to go back and revisit that, because there were lots of really, really good points. But the 3 points that I just want to bring out specifically today are: make sure that you have well-costed applications for a specific purpose. So going back to delivering on your core objectives. Ensure that you demonstrate need. So that goes back to what Paula was saying about understanding what you need. There are lots of charitable organisations that are asking for more funding to continue doing what they have been doing for the last 14 months or so. So you could now be in a position where you can demonstrate the outcomes of well-run projects in the past. So all of that narrative is really good for talking to funders. So that's my final point. Make sure that you've got all of those good outcomes that you can measure and you can say, yep, this had a good impact. I need this money because I can carry on delivering the service, and this is the enormous benefit that it can give to my community. So a few practical considerations. Meetings and AGMs obviously have been running virtually for the last year. They are able to take place in person, and it's very much up to each organisation as to whether there are practical and cost implications of continuing to run particularly small meetings as virtual meetings, because there are cost savings in doing that. It might be if you have a village hall, for example, and the trustees would ordinarily have met in one of the rooms, actually you would be able to hire that out to a group at a different time and the trustees could continue to meet virtually. You would need to build in the consideration for the use of that room in terms of needing to have cleaning pre and post the trustees meeting, and would it be better that that room could be utilised by a community group rather than necessarily a trustees meeting. So there are pros and cons. Obviously the social aspect of having an in-person meeting, you know, I can't wait to be able to do an audit close meeting with one of my clients face to face rather than trying to shuffle screens and bits of paper and that sort of thing. But if you've had very efficient and effective virtual meetings, it might be better to just have a look at continuing those meetings. So my advice here would be the Association of Chairs for really good advice in terms of running meetings, and also look at whether you are potentially impacted by changes in legislation in that respect. I think I read in the Bournemouth Echo over the weekend that Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council meeting had to take place in person because the legislation that allowed them to hold virtual meetings had lapsed, and it cost £6,000 for them to hold that meeting. I'm not suggesting for a minute that any of your trustees meetings or AGMs or whatever would be that expensive, but there are clearly cost implications to have a safe, secure meeting, to have a big enough meeting room that people can meet in. So just have a look at that as options for continuing with some of the good things in terms of virtual meetings. Cash versus contactless. There are lots and lots of options for not having to take cash, and cash, as we know, is one of those close contact things that if people are now used to being able to pay contactless, it might be that as your buildings, shops, etc. open up, you can look at a contactless option for that. Online fundraising and virtual events where we can't return to normal as such, we need to have a good hybrid model and actually take all of the good things that people have been able to do over the past year or so, and see if we can continue that and supplement that with the contact, the social contact, the community contact. Continue to look at social media. TikTok, which I must admit I hadn't heard of pre-lockdown one last year, has apparently got something like 125% increase in the user base. So just have a look at different options. You know, you've still got Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, website, all of that sort of thing, but have a look about whether, you know, there's something that you could run as a fundraising event, particularly that you could do on social media. And the last point that I just wanted to make was on flexible working. So you need to, again, look at the practicalities of having people in the building, whether you've got people who may not want to come back and are actually quite happy carrying out their role virtually. It's having that understanding of everybody's different and having those conversations to make sure that people are able to be as efficient and effective as you possibly can. And a lot of that is down to being nimble and being flexible, and having a look and seeing the cost saving measures that you may have been able to have over the past year or so, and whether some of those cost saving measures can carry on into the future and through the easing of lockdown. So my final slide is just a few additional resources. The only one that I just want to bring your attention to is the Charity Commission, who have got some new 5-minute guides for trustees on financial oversight, achieving a charity's purpose, good decision making, addressing conflicts of interest, and what to file with the Commission. So if any of you are trustees of charitable organisations, I can highly recommend having a look at the 5-minute guides, and they really and truly are just 5 minutes. So that's everything from me. Very, very happy to take questions either through the chat box or if Ray and Paula want to identify people that have questions. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Jen. There was one question that we've had come through to us in relation to the business grants that have been supplied, about how people will go about declaring this when it comes to income and corporation tax. Is there any advice or support you've got?
Yes, so we've put together a little 2-pager which we sent to Julie a couple of weeks ago. So if anybody wants to have a look at that, it is quite sort of legislation heavy, but the general rule with corporation tax is if you are getting a grant for something, then it generally will behave like a grant ordinarily would for corporation tax and for VAT. So it's a case of, and if you're getting grant funding for something from a government grant for something which ordinarily wouldn't fall under the tax regime, so it would count as charitable activities and therefore would be outside the scope of corporation tax, as a general rule, that funding that you've got to replace something that you hadn't got because of COVID will generally follow the same tax treatment, but it is quite dependent on individual organisations and their tax status. So if there is anything specific, I'm not a tax expert, but we have tax experts within Ward Goodman, and if it's just a 5 or 10 minutes having a look at the type of income and expenditure that you've got, and having a look at whether you've done a tax return previously. So there are some charities who are effectively needing to do a corporation tax return submission every 4 or 5 years, and they're on the ad hoc register with HMRC just to make sure that they shouldn't be paying tax, and there are other charitable organisations that regularly have to submit a tax return because they effectively have business activities that they undertake on a regular basis, and therefore they are subject to tax. So have a look and see what you've done previously, get all of your information together, and then feel free to drop it on an email to us, and if it's a case of just having a quick 5-minute look at it, we can do that, but general rule, if it wasn't taxed previously, it probably shouldn't be taxed now, but don't hold me to that.
Lovely. Jen, thank you very much. That was very comprehensive. We'll make sure that 2-page guide is with today's session resources on our website. Thank you for that. Joe, who I can't see on my screen, but I know you're there. Joe, was there anything in the chat bar which would be a question for Jen?
No, the only thing I've got here is from Kim saying, could we resend the link for, it says buy-in group, please. I'm not quite sure what buy-in group means.
That the charities buy-in group. Ray, do you have the link for that?
Not to hand, but I can add it to all the resources that are afterwards.
Lovely.
It is working, isn't it? Yes,
Yeah.
I can add it to the page afterwards.
That's lovely, thank you.
But no, apart from that, and just that it's nice to see that your labs are being great assistants.
They were very good, weren't they, in the end?
They were far better.
Bribed with biscuits. I was chucking a biscuit down every so often.
That's how they get me to cooperate at DCA. So it's a strategy that works for us all. Lovely. Jen, thank you once again for your time, which you give up so graciously to help us, which really appreciated, and the fantastic resources. And we will make sure that those slides are available as well for anybody who wants to just recap over them or any of the links. So thank you again, Jen. So all I'm going to do to wrap up today's session is just do a quick top 5 funding. So I will just share my screen, and again these will be shared as part of today's presentation. Jen, you're on my screen. Would you mind giving me a thumbs up if you can see that for me? Bless you. Thank you for that. So the first one is the nationwide Building Society Community Grants Programme. So this is quite substantial grants that they're offering, and they're looking really, I think, for quite innovative practice that helps people into a home, prevents people from losing their home, and or supports people to thrive within their home environment. So if you're involved at all in supporting people around homelessness, supporting people to be secure in their housing or settle into their home, it's definitely one for you to have a look at. It's a really good fund. We've also got a local support grant supporting learning in nature, and this is particularly useful for any nature-based group or wildlife group that would like to extend their range to be able to offer learning. It's a really good starting fund. It isn't really one for maintaining something. I think it's more cost-wise for getting something up and running. And they have rounds 1, 2, actually 2, 3 and 4. Round 1 has already gone in June, September and November. So it's worth having a look at. If you don't feel ready for it now, it could be something that you'd want to do later. Then we've got the Hilton Charitable Fund Summer Play Scheme grants. So any of you that would like to dip your toe into the water really around providing activities for young people during the summer months, this is a really good one. Now you need to be a Social Farms and Gardens member, but actually membership is free. And actually, if you are an outdoor activity or you're involved in nature, you're involved in growing, then it would be a really good thing to join and become a member anyway. So that might be worth looking at, even if you're not interested in going for the fund. The Co-op Local Community Fund is open for applications. It's a bit of a beauty contest. What they do is the co-op select up to 3 projects in a local area. They advertise those projects around their branches and then people vote on them. So you really want your project to sound dynamic, to really sound engaging, use some of that really good marketing dialogue in order to be able to entice people to see what your project's doing. This is not one for the dry application. This is exciting. Definitely get a picture in there. Really entice people to see why your project is a good project. And then finally, through the Dorset Community Foundation, there's the Wessex Water Environment Fund. And this is about improving local environments and having a positive impact on communities. So it has quite a lot of wide-ranging involvement, really. Anything at all to do with making the environment that people live in better. Nice, simple fund. We all know Dorset Community Foundation. Their process is rigorous but straightforward. And there's quite a nice lead in till the 4th of June for the deadline. I always worry that people are trying to write notes as I go through the top funding. It's really just to give you a flavour. Those slides are available with all the links, so you can just go straight from the slides straight to the application form page or to the application form. So lovely to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. I know it must feel like a bit of an overload of information that's hit you as we've hit step 3 of this roadmap, but of course it is the most significant opening up that we've had come our way. And for many of you, this actually could be your first opening up that you've done perhaps for a year. So it has been a very significant journey. Please don't think just because all this guidance is out there that there isn't other support available. Become a member of DCA. There's lots of other resources, particularly ACRE resources that are available through our membership, as well as discounts on future events. And remember that you can book a free appointment to talk through any of this with one of our advisors or any further issues. As opening up starts to have an impact on income, particularly with reduced capacity, as furlough starts to come to an end, there could be challenges up ahead. If you can see those challenges, put plans in place now to tackle them and get the support now, then actually you may not be tripped up about them later. So don't wait till you need us. Think about how you might need us and get in contact with us now. Lovely to see you all as always. I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Hopefully with all these bank holidays out of the way, we'll start to get our own rhythm back with our first Wednesday of the month being this webinar. But I think we'd all probably rather have the bank holidays. So we look forward to the next one. Have a lovely rest of week and I'll see you all very soon. Thank you.